we sitting here first or
sit there first?
Better for me. Eventually. I'll take my boots on my walls.
Alright everyone, thanks for being here, welcome. It's I don't know if it's a busy time of year or just a time where we all procrastinate much because we don't have classes anymore and we're all sort of getting ready for finals. So I'll start by quickly introducing how this conference came to be. We kept on hearing and feeling the buzz of the Ethereum blockchain when it was released last summer in July 2016. We run it by professors like Lohry, and they also expressed curiosity and enthusiasm, and that's when we started planning this conference. We were particularly excited about the topic of the blockchain because it impacts students from both real estate and architecture, which coexist at GSAPP but often lack common ground to interact on. So we have the honor to welcome 4 various speakers at our table tonight. The bios are detailed on the handouts, which you might have found on the chairs. Just a side note, they're printed on thermal sensitive paper to celebrate the occasion that this is a very hot topic. So every speaker will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, after which Ephraim will moderate a discussion in which the audience is invited to participate. During the Q&A, we are going to experiment with a new kind of format. We're going to project a Google Doc that you can access if you go to our Twitter, Ephraim.
It should be posted on
Twitter. It should be posted on Ephraim's Twitter.
The link may or may not be working, but we're working to it.
Yeah, that's for in an hour, and so we're gonna type real time as the conversation happens, and you're welcome to inscribe your questions or just your own notes or thoughts as it is happening. Our first speaker is Mike Goldin. So Mike Goldin began working on applications for the Ethereum blockchain during the summer of 2015 as an intern at ConsenSys in Brooklyn. He worked on the smart contract backend for Ujo Music and published 2 well-received introductions to programmable blockchains titled Just Enough Bitcoin for Ethereum and Ethereum, Bitcoin plus Everything. He will be joining ConsenSys as a full-time software developer after graduating from Columbia this May. Just a side note, because ConsenSys might come up often in the conversation, it's a venture production studio building decentralized application on the Ethereum blockchain. Our second speaker will be Kristoffer Josefsson. Christian is an IT consultant and peer-to-peer entrepreneur. He works on multiple projects for both Fortune 500 and bootstrapped startup companies. Christian's main focus today is to explore blockchain-based alternatives to existing systems and business processes. Our third speaker is Susanne Schindler. Susanne is an architect and writer focused on the intersection of policy and design in housing. From 2013 to 2016, she was lead researcher and co-creator of Housing, an ultimately history of architecture and real estate at Columbia's Temple Hornbill Center for the Study of American Architecture. She has taught at Parsons and GSAPP, writes frequently for publications including Places, Urban Omnibus, and Bauwelt, and is currently pursuing a PhD at ETH in Zurich. Our fourth speaker is Kristoffer Josefsson. Kristoffer is a mathematician who works at the intersection of social architecture and geometry. Formerly working for Fosters and Partners, he's currently a founding member of BlockApps, a blockchain-based platform for scalable computational architectures. In addition, he runs an experimental co-working space in LA and resides and works in Brooklyn. Manuel Schwarzberg is unable to join us tonight because he is sick. We will have, I think, Ephraim replace him moderating. So let me just tell you a little bit about Ephraim, who organized this event. Ephraim critically investigates the social, economic, and political issues issues that frame the fields of architecture and development. The group is researching the impact of digital technologies on the profession. We aim to establish a collaborative platform for young architects to share resources, incubate projects, and engage with alternative forms of practice. So on this note, I think Matt will go on and introduce in further detail the blockchain.
Thank you. All right, so I'm just going to give a little bit of a framework so that we all are on the same page. We're operating under the assumption that nobody in this room knows anything about blockchain. I know there's a lot of people in this room that know a lot about blockchain, but we're going to start from zero, okay? So Mike is going to talk about the future of the internet. Christian Saucier is going to talk about the historical context and basically real estate applications. Susanne's going to give us a bit of a reprieve from a lot of the tech, and she's going to talk about alternative property developments. Kristoffer is basically going to delve into some of the hardcore concepts, hopefully, maybe even including decentralized autonomous organizations. Fortunately, Manuel's not going to be here, so we're going to fill in the gaps, and hopefully you guys have enough questions to do that. What am I talking about? What is the blockchain? What is Ethereum? What is the political context? And why should we even care? Why are we doing this at GSAPP? Well, we do this. I want you to keep this in mind. This is a project in Berlin called R50 Baugruppen. And we had a chance to visit this last semester during the GSAPP housing semester. Basically, during housing, we did some travel in Berlin. And I show this because let's imagine that everyone in this room pools their resources and decides that they're going to build a building in New York City. And you can imagine all of the constraints that you would basically confront with. The first and most obvious being the real estate industry is very competitive in New York City, and we would probably not get the project off the ground. But let's imagine, because we know that these projects do exist in the real world, and it's part of what we're doing. Okay, so the basic question, the big question here is, how are resources owned, organized, and distributed? What is blockchain? And more accurately, what are blockchains, plural? And again, we're not here to tell you a single definition of the blockchain, nor are we trying to tell you a single application of the blockchain. It's a very political, very contested field of practice right now, but we hope that you approach this with adequate amount of cynicism, criticism, and curiosity. New York Times basically put it well. The system is complicated enough that even people who know it well don't know how to describe it in plain English. And this is an example. The blockchain is a distributed computing architecture where every network node executes and records same transactions, which are grouped into blocks. Right? Accurate but meaningless. So basically, let me give you some ideas of something to hold on to. The blockchain is not owned by any single person, group, or company. Data cannot be manipulated or censored. It eliminates third-party intermediaries, and it enables ownership of data of personal resources, and it secures transactions without centralized authorities like banks. To kind of key you into these concepts, there's a big difference between distributed computing and centralized computing. If you've ever downloaded music off of Napster, downloaded something off the Pirate Bay, used BitTorrent, that's not the blockchain, but you're thinking in the right direction. Centralized computing is large data farms owned by large companies. I'm oversimplifying, but that's the basic concept. Can you smell the blockchain? Can you touch the blockchain? Can you, what is the blockchain? No. So there's this big problem of representation, and there's all different kinds of ways people are trying to describe it. Using text and images. Sometimes it's called a decentralized ledger. Sometimes it's called law written in code. Sometimes it's called a world computer. And sometimes it's used to describe Web 3.0. And I think this diagram is both funny and problematic. But at least we can begin to think about the transition between Web 2.0, which is generally where we are now, where we're subjected to the ways other people want us to use the internet, and Web 3.0, where we're leaping into the internet and we're having agency, where we actually have some kind of ownership and authority in what we're doing. And we actually had an interesting debate last night where we couldn't tell if this guy was like jumping into the internet or if he was getting sucked into the internet, or shredded by the internet. But that's a political kind of question that hopefully will come up at the end. an unstoppable computational machine. What is Ethereum? To understand Ethereum, we have to kind of go back to Bitcoin in some ways. The blockchain is basically the operational infrastructure that allows digital currency to be transacted in the Bitcoin sphere. Ethereum is a fundamental kind of evolution of the blockchain that makes it far more advanced and more applicable to our daily lives. Ethereum was launched last summer, and this is part of a larger kind of evolution of these technologies. Ethereum itself has some more phases of development to go, and who knows, in the future there might even be another application that supplants Ethereum. But this is a large-scale thing. In 2013, Vitalik Buterin wrote a white paper introducing the concept. It became implemented, like I said, last summer. And it's live today. So you can see it working if you go onto this network status indicator. And it's up and running. If you don't remember anything about the blockchain, just remember that it eliminates third parties. It eliminates centralized third parties. And what does that look like? It's basically like cutting out the middleman. And it creates and facilitates what is called a peer-to-peer transaction. So now you can enter into a transaction between you and your friends, a buyer and a seller, a business and a business. What are intermediaries? Basically everything. Whether it's a social intermediary or if it's a financial intermediary, there's all kinds of intermediaries in our lives. Some are good, some are bad. The point isn't that everything should be decentralized. Some centralization is good in some cases. But this is to give you a sense of conventional companies right now. And now we have to imagine kind of a time where we're transitioning into another realm of applications defined by decentralization. And these are some of those applications. They're just being built now. Some are just in prototype phase. Some have integrated with large-scale companies, Fortune 500 companies, large banks. They're all picking up on this technology. This is no small thing. These are some projects that are currently operating in the architecture and real estate space. It's a very new concept, and these projects are just launching. They're all very exciting. What is the political context? We all know these companies, Uber and Airbnb, often cited as the sharing economy. But the misconception here is that there's really no sharing going on. What they're basically doing is attaching themselves to your resources, your car or your home, and they're making a profit off of it as a middleman. So Uber is the ultimate middleman in the transaction, and they're making a lot of money doing so. It's very political. You may have known about or seen the protests in France recently. Taxi drivers, or Uber drivers, are they employees of Uber? Uber obviously doesn't want to think so because their business model is basically built off the autonomous vehicle, which is soon to roll out. Airbnb, less obviously malicious, but if we think in terms of a little deeper critique, they have basically taken our domestic space, our most private space, and turned it into something that is a profitable commodity. An example of a decentralized application is Lazuz. I believe they're out of Israel. And they're doing providing the exact same service that Uber is, but they're doing it decentrally on the blockchain. And they're cutting out the middleman. And the way that these decentralized applications are able to function is they are written into something called a smart contract, which we'll define later, and they're verified on the blockchain. So that's how you can know that you're actually going to get paid for this transaction. Similarly, Slack is moving into the space of Airbnb. They're not a direct competitor, but they're providing all kinds of property sharing tools. So you can rent your bike, rent your apartment, rent your house, any kind of personal property. And again, the same model. In this case, for instance, you pay some of their hardware that they're building, and you pay a transaction basically, and that space becomes available to you for whatever period of time you write into the smart contract. So the smart lock is part of the Internet of Things, these embedded computational devices like Nest, which is a frequently cited example. There's a lot of politics here too. Google basically knows what you're doing. When you get a status update on your phone, it's not Nest, it's Google. And this kind of Internet of Things scales from the Samsung TV to the smart city. So it has global reach and it has ultimate scale. And the big question here is, our lives and what we do on the internet, while we may think it's meaningless and trivial or mundane, is actually very, very profitable and very useful to all kinds of companies. So that said, why should we all care? We're working in the context of architecture, real estate, and development. Land titles and property deeds will probably be the first application of blockchain in real estate. The deed is an archaic system, and it's prone to all kinds of inefficiencies and even corruptions. There's a lot of exploitation that happens through this inefficient system. If you put these systems on the blockchain, they can be secured without inefficient intermediaries. And what we do is we take a huge leap into the 21st century, where a building or a space or a property can have its own digital identity. And a building, for example, can track its changes. You can know all kinds of information about it, which makes the buying process much easier. And there's all kinds of design implications of this. Shared ownership and group design build, these concepts have existed forever, but the blockchain has all kinds of additional incentives for people to gather their resources, secure those resources, and work together on common projects. A lot of those forms of collaboration will be managed through distributed governance, and these are features that allow large groups of people who don't currently trust or know one another to have trust in one another. So I don't know some of you, but through the system, I could trust you. So we return to the basic question that we're thinking about tonight. How are resources owned, organized, and distributed? And how does the system production affect the outcome of design? That's kind of an obvious thing that happens in the production of buildings, but it's not something we often consider as part of the design process. And we should kind of position blockchain as one of many tools that we can use to kind of design these systems. And from that, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you all. I'm Mike. So let's talk about what the internet might look like 10 years from now. So we don't think about a lot of the interactions that we have with internet services and systems today because we've just become rather used to the way that things work. The web itself is no longer the miracle that it once was. It's very mundane to watch a video on the internet. You can play an online video game on a remote mountaintop, and that's boring. We also don't think about it as mundane and expected so much so as to be unconscious that we have these things called accounts on the internet. And what's interesting about that is that accounts are so much more prevalent in the online world than they are in the offline world. I don't have an account at my bodega. I don't have an account at the movie theater. I don't have an account with my friends. I didn't need an account to meet Matt at a party and be invited to speak here tonight. But we have accounts everywhere on the internet. Facebook, Google, and 300 others. We also don't think anything of the fact that these accounts know nothing about one another. My Facebook account knows nothing about my Amazon account, and neither of them know anything about my Columbia University ID. We just expect that. That's very normal. That's the way the internet has always worked for as long as we have all used it. So as a result of this, I have like 300 separate identities on the internet. And what's kind of weird also is that every single one of those identities is ultimately controlled and mediated by somebody who is not accountable to me. Facebook could change my profile picture. Twitter could tweet on my behalf. LinkedIn could say I went to Cornell. The New York Stock Exchange could halt trading at any time, and in that case, they actually do. So these are not catastrophic problems, but the fundamental issue that we need to trust entities which are not accountable to us on the internet has actually put a huge check on an entire dimension of what it's theoretically possible to do with the internet. So we're not doing things where this kind of unilateral administrative action would be truly consequential because we would be foolish to attempt it given the fundamental limitations at play. So when you think about it, these fundamental limitations, they've forced us into these annoying and unnatural schemas like having distinct identities between mundane services that we're not even trying to be secretive about. And because we're used to all this, we're so used to it, we haven't even considered what we might do if things were different. So what I'm going to talk about are two ways that the internet is fundamentally changing right now thanks to a technology called blockchains. This new internet, if you will, is arguably the most substantive advance in networked applications since the web itself. We are about to make a jump that big and of that great consequence. So the two topics I'm going to cover, the things that will change a lot in the next 10 years, are identity and trust on the internet. So let's start with identity. So Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Clout, the US government, 500 other companies you've never heard of, 498 of them are advertisers. All of these companies, they want to be the centralized point of trust through which your identity is verified. And this hasn't worked because, frankly, nobody is so submissive as to surrender control of something so important as their identity to something like a private company. And this isn't just a political thing. There are practical consequences if somebody pulls the plug on a data center in California and I disappear, bureaucratically speaking. That's like, you know, there are real consequences to that. We also can't really trust governments. It's not super smart to trust governments simply because I don't know who's going to be president 20 years from now. I don't know what kind of virulent anti-me sentiment will be coursing through American democracy then. I like to say that in 1918, no German would have predicted Hitler, to be a little tragic about it. But I don't want the government to be able to target me for anything, so we can't really trust them either. So to date, a solution for this, for establishing meaningful identities on the internet, has been precluded because everything devolves to servers. Servers which somebody owns, somebody pays for, and which they have ultimate control over. And this alone is incompatible with what we understand identities to be. Identities are free, and I mean that both as in freedom and as in beer. Richard Stallman famously said that free software meant free as in freedom, not as in beer, but identities are actually free in both senses. I have paid nothing to stand before you all and endear myself to you as a somewhat starry-eyed software developer. That's free as in beer. Furthermore, I am the only person who can alter your perception of me, and I do it by changing my behavior. That's free as in freedom. There has been no way to replicate this on the internet. By the way, what is an identity? We have to be able to define it super abstractly or else we fail. We can't say that an identity is these three fields with values in such a range, and that's largely because you can't fit prints into that. And frankly, it wouldn't really make a difference if we had 1,000 fields. It's not a matter of scale. We have to think about this in such a way. We need a solution that is totally agnostic to what an identity is, and in fact has to support multiple possible definitions of an identity simultaneously. So we answer that question with what's called public key cryptography. So now I'm going to get into how we actually start to solve this identity problem. So on blockchains such as the Bitcoin blockchain, which was the very first blockchain and it's used for exchanging a currency, identity is defined using public-private key cryptography. This mechanism for identity management is so powerful that it is used as the linchpin of a system, Bitcoin, which secures upwards of $6 billion US dollars in value today. A dollar bill, a paper dollar bill, is mine because I hold it in my hand. Dollars in my Bank of America account are mine because Bank of America has not yet lost them on my behalf. A Bitcoin is mine because I possess the private key in a public-private key pair to which they are attributed by every other user of the Bitcoin blockchain. To steal my Bitcoins, you would have to either steal and decrypt my private key, which would take thousands of years, or you could try to generate my private key by chance, which would similarly take thousands of years. So I have the same agency in controlling my Bitcoins that I do controlling my cash, in that I'm responsible for holding on to my wallet. But theft of my wallet is de-incentivized because it's encrypted anyway. And unlike a physical wallet, I can have backups of my Bitcoin wallet, so if I do somehow lose it and you find it, because it's encrypted, you have nothing and I haven't actually lost anything. So public-private key cryptography becomes an incredibly powerful tool for identity when we open the scope of what we may associate with a key pair, from sums of money to, well, anything. Why not? Absolutely anything. In the future, we'll say that a given key pair is associated with this Facebook account, this Twitter account, a credit score, a job at this company, which itself has an identity associated with a tax ID number, trust ratings from customers, so on and so forth. This probably maybe sounds like a nightmare for privacy. In fact, with blockchains, we can blow privacy out of the water relative to what we can do today. I don't have time to talk about it right now, but ask me later. So, public-private key cryptography is exceptionally powerful. It's been around for a long time. Public-private key cryptography itself is not actually new. It's what allows us to connect to websites and know that we're connecting to the real deal using HTTPS. We can detect man-in-the-middle attacks. We can have encrypted conversations with our friends and know that we're actually talking to our friends and not someone else. But we're missing a key component that will enable us to make real interesting use of these identities. And that's a public reputation system, or perhaps a system of reputation systems. And a reputation system is a system of attributions and attestations about a given identity. So Yelp is a reputation system for businesses, but it's centralized. It is censorable. It is subject to manipulation because somebody owns it. We need decentralized infrastructure to run a reputation system on if it's going to be truly meaningful. Otherwise, we've just wound up with yet another unaccountable server owner acting as an intermediary or gatekeeper who will inevitably find a way to capture our identities and sell them back to us. Yelp sells top listings for search results to whoever has the cash, not to whom is most reputable necessarily. And that is unacceptable for something as important as our identities. So we've talked about how we can use public-private key cryptography to establish identities for ourselves on the internet. But we're missing this important thing. We need decentralized infrastructure to run this identity system. And this is where trustless computing comes in. And trustless computing we solve with blockchains. So let's say we live in a world where everybody has good facility with public-private key identity. And this is actually already happening. You don't realize it, but just like email has kind of, you know what email is, it's penetrated your life. Public-private key cryptography is slowly like working its way into your brains right now. So let's say that we live in a world where it's very mundane. So one application for this you might come up with is online voting, because it seems to resolve the online voter fraud problem pretty perfectly. We just have to trust Uncle Sam to maintain a database of key pairs and to count the votes properly. One person, one vote. Uncle Sam can prove that one vote is attributed to only one person by having them sign a vote using their private key and then verifying it using the public key. Problem is, of course, we have to trust Uncle Sam. And it's worse than that. We have to trust Uncle Sam's software. And if you ever talk to a defense contractor, you probably don't want to trust government software. So voter fraud and electoral misconduct, if you've been following the primaries this season, even with our friends and neighbors counting the votes, like we don't trust what's going on behind the scenes when stuff gets counted. We're never going to trust software to do it. And furthermore, at a technical level, there is no way that if we were sending even cryptographically sealed votes to a server controlled by Uncle Sam, if it's not public, if it's controlled by the government, there's just no way that we can verify that votes are being tallied correctly. So we would be right to be skeptical about that sort of thing. So this is where blockchains come in. Specifically, what are called programmable blockchains. So here's the key definition if you were studying for an exam. Programmable blockchains enable the provisioning of autonomous, transparent, and auditable software. They preclude the possibility, mathematically, of interference not specified explicitly in their code. They do not run on servers. If they ran on servers, this would be unacceptable. These systems run on public infrastructure, which is the blockchain itself. The blockchain is a distributed system. It's distributed over thousands, millions, or billions of CPUs. Anyone can participate. It is completely unprivileged. And users are compensated by the network for participating in the network. That's mining, which you may have heard of, but we won't get into that. What participation means is to run software that works to audit or validate code being executed on the network. Everybody sees the same transactions, they run it against the same code, and they should get the same results. If anybody tries to fudge something, they'll need to be in conspiracy with 51% or more of other participants in the network to pass it off as legitimate. This is called a 51% attack. So you can think about a blockchain as an open world computer that everybody shares. It's one computer that we all use. We can all audit it and trust it equally. So these autonomous software agents which run on blockchains are called smart contracts. And a smart contract, this is the missing piece that we need to allow us to vote on the internet without having to trust Uncle Sam or anybody else. So how would this work? So the US Federal Election Commission, they're going to publish a smart contract on the blockchain for electing the next president. We don't need to trust them, though. It's not a problem that it comes from them because we're going to verify, we're going to validate that this smart contract actually does what they say it's going to do, which is count votes fairly. So we'll see that they have published a contract, and that contract gets an address. The address is a deterministic function of the publisher, its contents, and a unique value called a nonce, which is some technical nonsense you don't need to care about. Because blockchain is a decentralized technology, I can pull up this code on my own laptop, you can pull it up on yours, and we can have confidence that we're looking at the same thing. Now, we don't go through a centralized server to do this. We are participants, we are validators in this distributed system. So we have complete confidence that when we pull this up separately on our own computers, we're seeing the same thing. If every node on the network does not have a copy, in a sense, the thing doesn't exist at all. If you're not doing anything fishy, everyone will get a copy. If you are doing something fishy, you'll need to control 51% of the network to fool us. And by the way, controlling 51% of the network, that turns out to be a hard thing to do. If you can figure out how to do that, there's 6 billion bitcoins waiting for you to own. So we look at the code present in the address in question, and this will be machine code. This is hard to read. Theoretically, we could... Now, we can audit this. We can decompile this. It would be nasty. What would be preferable would be if the FEC published their source code. This is not election code. This is just some random code. So what we do, the FEC publishes their source code. We audit it. We compile it. And we just make sure that the byte code, the machine code, which comes out of our compiler, is the same code at the address on the blockchain that the FEC published. So if we can audit this code and say, okay, yes, this is doing what the FEC says it's doing, we just compile it, and if the bytecode matches, we're good to go. Now, obviously, not everyone is a computer programmer. Even if you have the source code, you might not be able to audit the contract code yourself. But because we have a strong identity system and a blockchain for trustless computing, this means that we can have an open public reputation system for this sort of thing. So if the most well-respected contract auditors deem this code at a particular address to be legit, people will submit votes to it. And without a reputation system, the way this works is people would just go on CNN and they would talk about it. That's just like the old world analog. We're just going to make that a little more rational with a reputation system, since any fast talker can get on CNN these days. So how do we tell who is a U.S. citizen eligible to vote, just to sort of walk you through another little case here that you might not have considered. So we use something called a registry, and we use it in conjunction with a reputation system. So this is going to, I don't know, maybe it'll blow your mind. We'll see. So the contract should only pass an audit if it exclusively accepts votes from identities registered as U.S. citizens, by identities registered as licensed obstetricians, by identities attested to as reputable medical schools by potentially just us, potentially just normal people. The trust chain could end there. It could end in some special committee, which people vote on in some way. But these trust chains can always end in normal people, people like you and I. And people like you and I, we have trustworthiness on the basis of what we say about one another. So this is perhaps the hardest thing to wrap your head around, but it's like, really, it's the way the world works. Like, if someone recommends me a bar, if a friend recommends me a bar, they have cachet with me, so I might check it out. If in the past they've given me crappy recommendations, I might not check it out. Why is a Columbia University degree worth more than some other degrees? As someone who's gone to 2 schools, I'll tell you there's really no great reason, but it has a good reputation. People think highly of it, and that means something. Like, we just have thoughts about things, and that's reputation, and it means something to us. Why do Supreme Court justices wear black robes and work in a building that looks like God's house? It's to help you respect them. Not every country has a Supreme Court that is respected by its population. Ours does, pretty well among all of us. But the point is, like, these things that are important to us, that matter in our lives, it boils down to what we think about them. Like the Supreme Court, we listen to it because we have some amount of respect for it. Also, they have some power. So really, this is the way the world works. It's just never something that we've been able to port onto the internet before. And now that we can put this on the internet, we can scale it in ways which are unprecedented. And that's the kind of tough thing to wrap your head around. That is the big thing that you should take away from this. So the web brought information to every corner of the earth. What blockchains will do is bring trust to every corner of the earth. That, in my opinion, is the big thing about blockchains. That's the world-changing thing about them. That's what's going to allow us to do interesting things that have not been possible before. It has never been possible before to use the internet as a trust engine. So just to resolve this, our little thing about voting. So everybody votes, the contract expires at some predetermined point, and then the winning candidate is going to be transparently visible to anyone participating in the blockchain, and there will be no hanging chads. Now in the future, we might set this up such that upon the expiration of the election contract, the private keys controlling the nuclear weapons and whatnot will be automatically transferred to the winner, to the identity of the winner, who wins the election, and the outgoing president would find their private keys are no longer good to unlock the White House. Smart contracts can be of arbitrary complexity, so you could think of any crazy scheme you want for how you might want to make this work if you're designing the FEC's election contract. So I'm out of time, but hopefully I've got you thinking a little bit about how blockchains work. The folks who talk next are going to talk about some more domain-specific stuff for all you architecture, design, real estate folks, and I appreciate your time.
Here we go. Next. One more. All right. Hello, hello everyone. My name is Kristoffer Josefsson, French-Canadian, so you'll have to get used to my accent over the next 15 minutes. Speaking of which, I'll start a little timer here, make sure I don't go too much overboard. Thank you for an excellent, all the complex technical basis has been put down now for me, so it's going to be easier for me to talk about how we can apply some of this to the real estate and to land management and property transactions. The company that I work for, Ubitquity, that's our specialty. We are a company that is building a blockchain system, blockchain-based system, if you will. We're using blockchain technology in order to work with a number of players within the real estate deeds and title transaction process in order to facilitate that process, reduce costs, reduce the time, and increase the confidence. We're going to talk about trust as well, in that the process is happening as we want it to happen. Before I go further, I'm just going to need a show of hands. Is everyone done with their final exam? I understand this was a big week. Who else still has exams going on? Okay, all right. I'll forgive you. I won't ask you guys to come up here and describe blockchain. Who else could describe blockchain now? Okay, yeah, it's hard, right? We've had two people so far talk about blockchain, and I work with blockchains on a day-to-day basis. And as you mentioned earlier, the experts, it's really, really hard to make really the impact of what this technology can do. So I'm going to try to reiterate a little bit of what you've had and you've heard so far, and bring that to something that is relevant to my business in the real estate world. Who's familiar with what this is? Mainframe computer. This is a pretty modern one, Blue Gene, I believe, from IBM. There's probably one of those on the campus here somewhere. Mainframe computers have been around since the 60s, late 60s and 70s. They're still around, right? Your banks and lots of large institutions still rely on this technology to host some of their most precious information. Data like the New York Stock Exchange and the Royal Bank of Canada, and large institutions that hold very valuable data, they hold a lot of that on these kind of computers. They're centralized, they're in special room behind special doors with special guards, and it's really, really hard to get to one of these. But they're in one room with one door and one guard in one place, right? All of that data, while it might be backed up some other place around the world, it still resides on this one central system. We've been doing this, as I said, since late 60s, 70s, so this is old technology that's been around for a long time, and we've just been incrementally improving it over the years. And then in the late 70s and 1980s, something else happened. The personal computer, right? Everyone's got a personal computer nowadays. And what was the Bill Gates quote at the time? Oh, no one will ever need more than 640 kilobyte of RAM on their computer, right? There was a revolution where suddenly some of the smarts were taken out of the server room and brought on your desk. And your desk computer now had some of the information and some of the processing. So suddenly you could do things like a spreadsheet and calculate locally, like kind of a scrapbook, how to do something, and then send whatever results to a server that was owned by the company or whatever. And suddenly that company didn't just have one big server in New York City in the basement of the building. No, every floor of the organization, every department of the university had its own server with specialized applications for whatever purposes, you know, the server is dedicated to. So we had suddenly decentralized, and we're going to head towards blockchain here, we had suddenly decentralized the processing and the storage and the control of the information that is being used for whatever business process is at play. And then what happened? The internet. With the internet, suddenly we took these servers that sat in this department, and that faculty over there, and we took these computers and we just spread them all around the internet. And now you've got companies all around the world who actually host information, and you use that same personal computer that you've had now for many decades on your desktop. You use that to access information, not just from your local, you know, department, but from anywhere around the world. So suddenly the information had further decentralized. You were even more empowered as an individual user in the network by being able to get out there, not just to the company that provided you access to the network, like CompuServe or whatever. Now suddenly you could get out beyond the borders of, you know, your immediate infrastructure and connect with anybody anywhere around the world. The amount of power and personal control that was gained in that process, from centralized mainframes to client-server infrastructure, and to now in the 1990s and 2000s, the World Wide Web, the amount of individual liberty and individual control that you have over your information and information that you're able to get from your computing infrastructure has grown exponentially. Right now on this phone, I can access Wikipedia, which has the best library ever invented by mankind. You can access specialized application for your field of expertise. You can network with the best in the field of whatever you do. So suddenly that becomes a very empowering tool that we all can use to become better individuals, professionals, players, and so it's good for entertainment, it's good for professionalism, it's good for all of us, right? We all benefit from the fact that we are all individually more empowered by this computing infrastructure. The latest evolution of all this empowerment, if you will, that has been brought to us by information technology is cloud computing. So now, even though my phone here is not as powerful as this computer to process information and whatnot, I don't really care, because now with cloud computing, from my phone I can access not just my data, but also the processing power, owned by Amazon or Google or someone, right? And now we can share that information across even devices that have very radically different level of computing power. Cloud computing kind of homogenizes all of that and allows us to, whether we have a very expensive computer or a very cheap piece of networking component, we're still able to do some pretty complex interactions. I can run a spreadsheet on that phone. Of course, this phone is pretty good, but even if you have a relatively cheap and low-end computer, you can connect to your Google spreadsheet, something on the cloud, and actually do some pretty sophisticated, computing, on that technology. And now we're getting to blockchain. Blockchain, if you look at the steps that we've talked about, from the 70s to the 80s, when we moved away from centralized to client server, from the 80s to the 90s and the 2000s, when we move away from client server and when I say move away, all of the past still exists. We still have client server solutions, we still have mainframes, but there's new technology that come and supplement, if you will, some of the basic infrastructure that still exists since the 70s. Today, the latest evolution, or the latest jump, if you will, in this is this blockchain technology we're talking about today. What blockchain will do to our ability to interact with one another through the trust network, through the identity, being able to prove the identity of one another, on this network, which is not something we're able to do today. What blockchain will allow us to do over the next 5, 10, and 15 years will be as radical as what the web has allowed us to do compared to prior to the web. If you go back to 1992 and you've got a great idea that you want to share with the world, that was pretty hard, right? You need to call CNN or the Wall Street Journal or someone that has people's eyeballs and someone that can publish your information. If you're a singer, you need to go to the distribution networks. If you're a movie maker, if you're an artist, if you're whatever you do, you are looking at these vast and large companies or channels, let's call them, in order to distribute your information. The web has transformed that, right? You've seen a lot of these large companies. Some of them have fallen. Who went bankrupt just this week? Sports Authority, I think, in Florida. It's a brick and mortar. It's been popular for many, many years. They were killed by Amazon. It's cheaper and easier to go buy your sport hockey stick or whatever Sports Authority sold than driving down the road and going to Sports Authority. And they just couldn't adapt, and they haven't survived the transition from old centralized to web-based purchasing online. Same thing will happen with this blockchain technology. It is as important and as transformative as what we've seen in the past. And a way to exemplify that or illustrate that, maybe I should stay close to the microphone, you see there the centralized server. That's your mainframe, right? That's how a lot of us think of, and still how a lot of our processes today operate. If I write you a check that says $1 million, and I give it to you, check me out. Do I look like I've got $1 million in my bank account? Probably don't, right? So you're not sure. So what are you going to do? You're going to go to my bank, the central authority that's going to clear that check, right? And you're going to call them up saying, hey, I got a check here from this dude. Before I give him whatever he's buying for $1 million, can you validate whether account number 123 has $1 million, right? So the bank is the authority. The bank is the person that we all trust. And if the bank says yes, then yeah, we're happy. And when the bank says no, not really, then we're not happy. But that all resides on us trusting that bank or trusting the U.S. government to validate, the votes that you give them. And then we move to a more decentralized network. The decentralized there, that's very similar to what we have today with the web. When you saw all the list of the various identities that you have online, you don't have one. You don't only have one, right? You have one with Google, you have one with Facebook, LinkedIn, and all the myriads of various companies out there. And of course, these companies are working really hard at trying to link these identities together in order to derive even more, consumer patterns and behavior, from you. But it's much more of a decentralized system where you still have central hubs of information and central hubs of power or authority, but there's multiple of them, right? And so it's distributed a little bit. And as we saw, the web has really transformed how we interact with the world around us. So whereas originally you had to go to the New York Times in order to publish an opinion if you wanted a lot of people to view your opinion about something, now you can start a blog. Right? And there's multiple places where you can start a blog. You could have a Facebook account, you can have whatever other accounts out there, and certainly you're empowered individually by being able to reach out to more people. Now, of course, it's hard to get noticed on the web, right? It doesn't change any of the reputation that you might need in order to attract attention. But still, with the web, you have a chance that your article will go viral, and when it does, certainly the whole network, starts noticing, and your chance of having an impact in the world, whether it's through article or art or whatever it is that you do, is much greater in a decentralized network where you have different points of power that you can use in order to influence the community around you. Bitcoin, Ethereum, blockchains, all of these technical terms, those are distributed network. Certainly, when you look at a distributed network, there is no single point of power. My phone runs a client. Your computer runs a client. Her computer over there runs a client. And all of our computers are exchanging information together. The server is a little bit here, a little bit there, and a bit over there as well. And together, the way the code is implemented on this blockchain architecture allows all of our devices to synchronize with one another and agree on a state of truth. So instead of you having to call my bank asking, hey Christian, or hey banker, does Christian have $1 million in his bank account? Now your computer is able to talk to her computer and check if she has any records proving, there goes my centralized phone, proving that that I have $1 million or not in my bank account. So this distributed network agrees on one state of truth. And that is a fundamental change, as we've seen earlier, in how computing happens, in how we engineer IT systems. And as you can see, IT systems have a lot of influence on our lives today. It will impact whatever it is that you do, professionally and personally, as a career or as an individual. Whatever you do over the next 5, 10, and 15 years, and definitely if we're talking about architecture and design and systems that you build that will last hundreds of years, right? I mean, they will outlast any government, they will outlast any bank. This building here has been, I don't even know how long it's been around, but, these stay for generations and generations. A distributed network, as long as we have power in the internet, these networks don't go down. They cannot go down. Over there, you just shut down the point in the middle, and suddenly everybody is naked and wondering what to do. In a decentralized network, sure, you gotta attack multiple points, but still, you can figure out a couple of pain points and shut down the efficiency and the efficacy of that network. On a distributed network, unless you shut everybody down, and obviously these are global networks, so it's happening in China, it's happening in Australia, in Africa, in North America, and everywhere. So unless you shut the whole network down, this network continues to talk with one another. So very, very resilient system. Many companies are using this. You might not be familiar with a lot of these icons right now, but you will be in the near future. Ubitquity, that's my company over there. Ethereum, this is the blockchain that we're talking about tonight. It's a very, very flexible computing architecture that will allow us to build these systems that will transform your lives. Storage, that's an example of a company that uses this kind of decentralized network in order to share storage on your hard drive. I have storage on my phone, there's storage on this computer. You can put that storage to use and share it with other people. So other people can save information on your hard drive at a cost, and you get paid for that. Just like Dropbox, you pay Dropbox to store information there. Well, with storage, it's tens of thousands of computers around the world who get paid like a little bit of money in order for you to be able to save your information in the distributed or decentralized network across hundreds or thousands of computers around the world. So if Dropbox gets shut down for some various, Dropbox is found to have child pornography or something, and the government goes in and says, all right, you got to shut down these servers right now, then we're allowed, right? With a system like this, it doesn't solve the child pornography problem, but the network cannot go down unless you shut down the entire internet, essentially. Bitcoin is probably, one of the most common terms that you might have heard before coming here. BitTorrent is also probably something that you've been exposed to. BitTorrent's got like, yay, you can copy, fake, illegal movies. So a lot of people think that, that is used for just bad things. But no, BitTorrent's used by Microsoft and all sorts of companies out there in order to share information. All right, let's apply this to real estate. Real estate is a complex process. When you transfer and when you record title changes and deeds against a title, there's a lot of people involved. We have a lot of history around real estate that involve a bunch of players who essentially need to trust one another. And we have all these archaic systems, paper-based systems where, we sign this piece of paper, you go meet with the attorney, and the attorney sends the paper to the buyer and the seller, and the whole process takes a long time. It involves a lot of people. It is very costly, and as we saw earlier, there's a lot of middlemen. There's a lot of agents involved in this. What blockchain can do is create what we call a smart asset, a smart token on one of these blockchains that represents the property that you're wanting to transact. And certainly all the players who are wanting to be party in that transaction or need to be party in that transaction can interact with a central engine, a central entity, that smart asset on the blockchain. But the smart asset is decentralized across the entire world. So all the players have one source of truth. We all agree on the current state of the system without having to have one attorney or one bank or one central agent that controls everything. So when you look at the history of a building or a piece of property over time, which brings that complexity even higher. Is there a clean title over this house? It's hard to tell. Sometimes you got to go look in very, very old books. What the blockchain allows you to do is record information about this property over a period of time in such a way that is provable. Yes, this company did a title search on this date, and their findings was that the title was clear. And once that is signed and secured on a blockchain, 20, 30, 40 years later, someone can witness that signature, validate that it's true, without having to travel to some county office somewhere and digging up old dusty books. It is all available to anyone online to be able to publicly view that the information was recorded accurately, and was signed by an entity that, if we have good reputation, if it has a good reputation, that you will trust on the blockchain. So, just in conclusion, what that means to your particular business and what you're wanting to do with your degrees and your careers, it's yet to be known. We don't know that, right? We are like the web in 1996 right now. It's a great technology. We know it's transformative. Understanding it is the first step. And in 1996, no one could have imagined what the web was going to become in 2016, 20 years later. Just like this, no one understands yet, not me, not anybody else in this room, how big this technology can be. All we know is that it has the same transformative power that the web has, or at least some of the same attributes that we saw with the web, and it's happening right now. So get involved, ask us questions after this, come see other conventions and ask questions about it, because one thing you can be sure is that this technology will change your life.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk about a model that's probably about 100 years old, so looking forward to bridging the forward-looking with a backward-looking. I was asked to talk about alternative development models. Because this is an old model, I'm going to be talking about, I've stuck away from alternative. It's actually a very conventional model, but it's been much underused. I'm talking about nonprofit cooperatives, which you could say it's a form of crowdsourcing for real estate development. 4 things I'm going to address. What is nonprofit cooperative housing? There's also other words for it. In this country, it's often called limited equity co-ops. I'm going to look at 2 recent examples built in Zurich, Switzerland. Then the question, why does it work there? Why doesn't it work here? And what about community land trusts? And what about Baugruppen, which we saw in the introductory presentation by Matt. So what is nonprofit cooperative housing? Did I just skip something? Oh. As you can see from this 1968 ad, one of the biggest developers here in New York City of nonprofit co-ops was a federation of nonprofit organizations established to promote better housing at lower cost. Sounds pretty good, no? Why aren't we doing it now? Brief 4-point summary. What are they? So cooperatives, remember, it was the only legal form of multifamily homeownership in the United States before the condominium was introduced in 1961. So the difference between a cooperative and a condominium is that a cooperative is a shareholder model where everybody owns a share and has a right to an apartment or part of that overall development. A condominium, you own your unit outright and you own a defined fraction of the land underneath that thing. So that's why if you hear about co-op boards, the co-op boards have to approve whoever enters that shareholder model. If you own a condominium, you can just sell it to whoever you want. You don't have to network with your neighbors. But this model also emerged after the First World War as a third way for housing production, something that was not public housing, so it was not state-run and also not private and speculative. So the idea was to develop a sector of housing that would stay outside of the market perpetuity. So residents buy shares and pay monthly carrying charges. And this basic nonprofit identity of, I'm going to use some of your terms, the identity, the trust model, that's central to European cooperatives, was changed was never really central to United States cooperatives, but in the Mitchell-Lama law, which you might have heard of in New York City or New York State, the nonprofit principle was quickly eliminated because not enough developers were picking up on this model, and in the so-called exit clause. So once the state-provided mortgage was paid off, the cooperators or the owners of the development, Mitchell-Lama also funded rental properties, were able to exit the price restrictions and the nonprofit models of that thing. So I'm interested in cooperatives because it has produced some very excellent architecture and is in a way a form of crowdsourcing for permanently affordable housing, or housing that's managed at cost but not at profit. But that hasn't really proved so doable here. So just a brief historic overview, 1920s Berlin. So this is a sort of an anti-urban settlement pattern, but it's taken on many forms. New York City and the Bronx, the amalgamated cooperatives is trade union-based housing. This was pre-Mitchell-Lama under the New York State limited dividend law, which actually does not have an exit clause, so all of this housing is still affordable. Some of the other projects you might know, Penn South, just between 8th and 9th Avenue south of Penn Station, was a slum clearance project, also done by the United Housing Foundation, that has opted to stay limited equity, so this is still nonprofit, very cheap. And the Co-op City, which you might also know, was sort of the last and the largest with 15,000 apartments up in the northeast Bronx. But the cooperative model also became applied in the 1970s when there were a lot of abandoned properties in New York City, which is hard to imagine today, but because of tax delinquency, a lot of the properties in Harlem, in the Bronx, and Brooklyn became city-owned, and in many cases the city transferred the ownership of the building to the tenants, who were made into cooperators, and partially had to invest their own sweat equity. And just so the issue that I've brought up already, a lot of these over 100,000 units that were built since 1955 into the 70s have chosen to go market rate, and one of the most recent ones is Southbridge Towers, which is now market rates. So, okay, so two recent examples of Zurich in terms of what's possible. Zurich is in Switzerland. It's a high-price city, just like New York City. First one completed in 2014. Mixed-use, new construction on the site of a former garage for streetcars. 97 apartments for 250 people, everything from micro units to 7-bedroom apartments, shared kitchen, bed and breakfast, retail, and also I have to say this, I think 40% office and 60% housing. Just a brief view. It's a very strange site between two big streets and a train. This is while it was being completed. So here you can see the ground floor is a garage, and on top of that garage is a park, and then the housing, cross-section, and again, there's all the different things that are meant to happen here concurrently. This is in construction, and here is an overview of all of these different things that happen. How is this funded? To become eligible to live here, you pay a membership due. That's about 1,000 Swiss francs, which is about $1,000. So if 900 people apply, there's already sort of a pot of $1 million. Once this is built, you apply. If you get in, you then make a You buy your share. So for, let's say, three or 4 bedroom apartment, that might be 25,000 Swiss francs, and then you pay maybe 1,800 a month. If you leave, you sell that back to the cooperative. These are sort of older pictures. I'm going to go sort of quickly. The other one I'm looking at is a larger new development, the whole neighborhood of 13 buildings, almost 500 apartments, and again, a very big mix of living forms. That's the urban design buildings were realized by 5 different architects, and each building had a certain idea: live, work, or large households, small households, so on. This is it finished, and just 2 types that are interesting. This is a cluster type, so it's basically a number of micro units, which is something that's much discussed in New York, but they're grouped together around a shared living space. And these are family units, so these are much larger. Some of them have 2 entrances, and again, they're organized in a way that even within an apartment, you can sort of separate. You can imagine that the grandparents live on one end, and the couple at the other end, and the child even somewhere else. And that's just an impression of that. So why does it work there, and why not here? In these examples in Zurich, the land is generally public, in public ownership, and it's leased and not sold outright. So what New York City did with all that housing and real estate that it got in the 70s, New York City wanted to put it right back into private ownership as quickly as possible to get it onto the property tax roll, because that's the main source of revenue. In Zurich, they're leasing it, 99-year leases, and the cooperatives that are built there, they pay a fee. It's not as if they get it for free, but doesn't have the same status as property tax here. Housing is seen as a long-term investment, operated at a cost, not to make profit. But let's go through this. I'll do the American ones then. Commercial lenders are on board. Actually, all the lending for these projects is absolutely simple, straightforward banks. There's nothing fancy about it. Individuals who then buy into this can actually draw on their pension funds at no penalty. So everything that you've put away already, you can use towards buying one of these units. And design is seen as a driver of quality, whereas in New York, again, the public land, there's hardly anything left, but it's typically been sold. So if you're trying to do this kind of model now, you're competing against other people. Housing is seen as a main household wealth builder. So actually, this is something interesting we could discuss later. How does this, in a system that prioritizes that you save for retirement by buying a home, and assuming that the home will gain in value, and that will be what you draw on when you need it. That's not the case in many parts of Europe. Lenders are skeptical. Again, property taxes are the main source of municipal revenues, disincentivizing nonprofit development, and design is sort of seen as a necessary evil that just costs more and complicates everything. So just a side note to 2 models that are sort of being talked about quite a bit also in architecture schools or on the campaign trail. So what about Burlington? I mean, Vermont, where Bernie Sanders used to be the mayor. And what about Berlin, which has become sort of a central point for the Baugruppen. Baugruppe is a building group, literally people who come together to build something. So Sanders actually introduced the Community Land Trust in Burlington while he was mayor there in 1984. It now operates about 2,000 rental apartments and 500 homeownership. But the basic principle of a community land trust is that the ownership of the land is separated from the ownership of the buildings, meaning that land can be managed in some way and at cost by a group of stakeholders, and the person who buys or rents the apartment on it, again, pays a fee, sort of like a lease. But by this model, I actually haven't quite understood how it works, but in this model, you can keep it affordable because once the house is sold, 75% in the case of Burlington, 75% of the sales price goes back to the land trust, and the person who sold it takes 25%. I'm assuming there are additional affordability restrictions that you cannot just sell at whatever cost you can get. And again, the land trust is governed by various stakeholders, typically people who live in the buildings, people who live in the larger community, and some other experts or public official. Then the Baugruppe. I googled Baugruppe, and this was the second one who came up, so it's interesting that we have the same example. The Baugruppe is typically, it's often launched by architects or smaller groups of residents who have direct say in the design. They want to decide how they want to live, and they pool their resources. They can be cooperatives, they can exist on a community land trust, but they don't have to, and the typical ones that have been in the press in Berlin are organized as condominiums. And they're typically not deed restricted in any way. That means they're affordable because of the low cost of land that has existed there so far, and they save money by eliminating the middleman, the developer, but they're not affordable in the sense of nonprofit. So the building which you saw, if one of these, I don't know how many there are, 24 families living in here, wants to sell, he or she can do that at whatever price they can get. Nobody else has a say. So in that sense, they're not, they're a great tool to have a greater say as a person in how you want to live and to crowdsource in that sense, but they're not they have nothing to do with outsmarting the market system in that way. So that was just my small contribution. Thanks.
Yeah. Let's see. Right. Thanks for having me here. Thanks, Susanne, for the very interesting historical context of what we're talking about today. So my name is Kristoffer. I'm a mathematician by trade. I work developing Ethereum software. But by night, I'm a DIY architect, and I've also previously worked in a big architecture office. And I just thought I'd give like sort of like a personal journey through architecture and the development of blockchain and the promises thereof through some sort of smallish projects that I've been working on, and hopefully it can serve as a sort of like a down-to-earth say context for what's possible. Okay. So as a mathematician, you're very aware of the bond between architecture and mathematics. You can look at, like historical buildings such as the pyramids using a very primitive algebra to decide the form. Then you have, the introduction of like quadratic forms and, cathedrals and such. With the exponential function that came with the advent of discovery of dynamical systems such as planetary movements, today we can see reflected in sort of parametric architecture and biomimetics. The fourth function you see here is the hashing function, which is the basic, most fundamental primitive function in cryptography and thus blockchains. I guess I'm going to try to argue that this mathematical function will also be a significant form giver in architecture, although it's an invisible form. It's an economical form. Can I press play here? Maybe not. When I was working for Foster & Partners, and I heard about the blockchain, I immediately sort of like, well, this is great. Pirate BNB. We have, Pirate Bay. Everyone loves Pirate Bay. Everything's free. You have sort of like autonomous organizations of dwellings, and you have some kind of like Airbnb-like distributed, pirated living community. And so I was quick to register this domain.
Great logo.
So when you hear about blockchain and the promise of this kind of like libertarian utopia, it's easy to sort of think of also a somewhat like a more dystopian scenario where you have a peer-to-peer economy, no one's paying taxes, everything's run by these sort of technocratic smart contracts on computers which you don't even know where to locate anymore, but all your identity and all your money is tied into it, so you're kind of helpless. Could pretty much become a nightmare scenario. So I think it's important to highlight some of the more positive aspects, because this is a pretty frightening scenario. Back to architecture. So this the company I was working for, Foster & Partners, designed a sort of like a landmark building, somewhat famous. It's the HSBC Bank in Hong Kong, built in 1985. This is, I think, like an architect's, rendering, or probably not rendering back then. Big client, right? Like one of the largest banks in the world, and you have this kind of perfect scenario, customers and tourists walking around. In reality, this place is kind of famous for being repurposed during weekends when I think mainly Philippine women use the space when it's rainy outside and they can't go back to where they're from their work. And there's a kind of like interesting dynamic here, I think, for the architect and the client, which are ostensibly large property owners, that the architect is very much dictated by the client's needs. On the other hand, they're trying to design for people, but they're also unable to respond to the actual needs of the people when they're dwelling in their buildings. And what's less known about this is that after Occupy, where this was occupied with many tents, the owner of the building actually asked Foster again to redesign the square very subtly, maybe introduction of one or two water features that, at a given moment would all just spurt water and make it just slightly uncomfortable to remain. But of course water evaporates and then it's back to normal. I think it also illustrates the sort of predicament that the architect is in, that he or she is working on these grand projects, has a lot of big ideas, but in reality, most architects, and I would say maybe most individuals in today's society, is kind of like limited to creative expression on this scale. This is a Lego model of the HSBC Bank. So there's a real discrepancy between the domain of architects that can move people and organize people on a daily basis, and what being dictated by the structures of ownership in public space today. So one of the responses in my life to this was this in London, 2012. This is like central London. My colleague and I, we started a sort of, what did I write? Let's see. An informal network grown organically and bootstrapped by Airbnb. This was at the beginning of the sharing economy. We built and hosted an economical and creative shelter against the economical tidal waves that put individuals to their, what did I say there? That tie the individuals to their Lego kits at night and at daytime to their day jobs. So this is in the middle of gentrifying central London, Shoreditch, where we sort of, let's say, inhabited an abandoned warehouse and tried to create a very cheap live-work scenario where we had some 400 people through in 1 year to live and work, anything from 1 day to, I think, 6 months was the person staying the longest. A very simple kind of architectural model. You're in a great space, you want a bed, that's an art crate, it's a room, here's a missing picture. It's kind of like a city within a city, expressing the idea of a shelter from the economical reality of the outside. Then comes, at least in my life, the introduction of the promise of the blockchain, right? So what the issues you're facing as a community are often like, how do you share, please remind me when time is, okay. How do you share property in this kind of international context where you're not necessarily close friends, but you still have a common goal? And the promise of the blockchain is to somehow, like through software, codify these ownership and stake relationships that you can have in organizations, and maybe even like property. So here's a project by Ryan in the audience called Foam Space, investigating kind of like what the introduction of blockchain into architecture. This is it's an experiment with the sort of like the core upholder of the network that we've been hearing about, the miner, which is powering this decentralized network that you heard about, as an architectural element. So it's actually heating up the space through the wasted energy that goes into the blockchain. And so, let's see. I think one of the aspects that's interesting with the introduction of blockchain into architecture is that from an economical point of view, as Mike alluded to, everything is transparent on this platform. So you have source code that's transparent. You actually get an economical incentive to participate in transparent structures. You could, of course, imagine like, well, okay, someone made a decentralized or autonomous organization running on the blockchain. Why don't just someone take that, modify it to their own advantage, and then make more money than the alternative that is open and free? Well, the problem is that they will have a problem getting people to join their network. So there's an interesting aspect in blockchainifying most anything, in that it economically incentivizes transparency. And I think the sort of what's the word? Potential for that is yet to actually be seen. We have a natural kind of like distrust against organizations because it's rational from an economical perspective, if nothing else. As a last set of slides, I'm going to show sort of my conclusions at this, or current work in downtown LA. We're building a co-working space, sort of inspired by the phone space idea. We have our mining unit supporting the Ethereum blockchain, and we are very much incentivizing participants in the space to be shareholders in the space itself. It means that we have a token that represents it could represent something monetary, such as paying the rent, but it could also represent something you contributed into the space. So automatically, by just being in the space or helping out or paying, you become a shareholder. And this is sort of like in total independence of your original relationship to the space. So you don't have to know the owners, you don't have to sort of like be in a privileged position necessarily. Let's see, I stopped looking at my notes. So I think this is a meaningless picture. Okay, that's the space. I think a point of this in a longer term is to start thinking about once you have stake in most of the spaces that you're inhabiting, either from dwelling in them or working in them or contributing to them. The border between like work and life as we know it, which already is kind of dissolving, is then again being, this solution is being supported potentially by the tokenization of reality in this way. And the blockchain really ties into architecture in that sense, that it provides the sort of like the virtual architecture or virtual space in which these kind of transactions take place. So I guess I urge architects and other people interested in space to think about the blockchain as a new space to explore and build into. Right, thank you.
All right, so there's probably questions. If you guys want to like get wine or do whatever you want to reset, invite all the speakers up here to field questions. So think about anything you might have missed or any questions or curiosities you have, and we'll have a discussion. Thank you.
Possibly, yeah. Probably on the battery.
4 hours left. We got new SD cards, so it's empty.
Oh, it's in there. I'm sure it's amazing.
It's like much worse than
But thanks for it.
Rest assured that you will get to know down here.
And we'll ask any questions that can provide that. Okay, so there's a lot of information here. There's a lot of potential disconnects. There's a lot of crossover. I think we should consider again, first of all, we're going to open it up and ask if anybody has any direct questions. But let's think again back to the original question of resources and how these resources can be tokenized on the blockchain, for example, and how they relate to these other methods of or collaborative design. So does anyone have any basic questions from any part of the internet system. Yes.
Oh yeah. So there's any code out there that wants to change the source code, basically the rules, how this mechanism to go about it, who has authority to do it.
So if anyone has the authority to do that, the source code for Ethereum or Bitcoin, any of them, it's all publicly available. So if you want to, so any of the altcoins like Litecoin or Dogecoin, those are just forks of the original Bitcoin source code. Anyone can do that and alter the code. The trick is you have to then get people to care about your network and join it. Otherwise, what you're doing has no value. So there are plenty of altcoins that are in the graveyard permanently because they just aren't that creative or interesting. They do anything that differently from Bitcoin. Ethereum, for example, has value because it does something hugely different from Bitcoin in the possession side, since it's a very complete programming environment that anyone can write. So anyone can alter existing programs by taking the source code.
If I can add to that, remember when I had the centralized, decentralized, and distributed system? On the distributed system, any one of those dots can change color, if you will, right? You can make a change on your own computer about that code, but then you're on your own, right? The trick, as you said, is to convince the rest of the network that yours is better. And obviously, as we saw earlier, if yours has an unfair advantage, saying, well, I give myself a million Ether coin or whatever, right? Well, everybody else in the network is going to be like, oh, I don't want to be part of your network, it makes no sense. So it involves a level of check and balance, if you will, in the fairness of whatever change you're wanting to do in your code. Recently in the Bitcoin network, for example, there's been a lot of battle over the last 12 to 18 months as to how should Bitcoin evolve, or if it should evolve beyond what it is today. And that battle has been going on. There was another group that said, well, we need Bitcoin XT. And they convinced, I think at the height, like 20-some-odd% of the Bitcoin network to actually use essentially a separate type of Bitcoin. It was compatible with the other one, but it was also competing for certain features that it wanted to distribute to the entire network. And in the end, that it democratically failed by people who run the Bitcoin nodes all around the world deciding not to use that one, but to continue to use the original one. And so, for the first time, really, there was essentially a democratic vote on whether you should upgrade your software or not. And I think at this point, the network has voted. Bitcoin remains as it was a year ago, and that's what Bitcoin is.
So technically, what you're saying that we can technically generate 1,000 versions of different evaluation systems.
Yep.
Totally.
You'll be in the network of one until you convince someone else to do server.
Just add a comment to that.
We'll just add a comment and then we'll...
When you look at all these blockchains, they're usually identified by these long strings of numbers. And they look innocent enough, but what they kind of represent implicitly is like, for all practical purposes, infinite address space. And it's kind of difficult to grasp that infinity. But it's a kind of like a materialization of infinity. And so there's really like, saying like, well, I'm just going to upload this contract like 100 million times per day through my, whatever process I'm running is actually not an issue at all. 100 million is nothing. And for practically any process that you can imagine, this address space will just be sort of like an ever-expanding void. Just something to keep in mind.
You have a question?
Yeah. So I understand Bitcoin, or at least I think I do, but I don't understand it when you guys take it to property. Like okay, so Bitcoin works like, we all agree that Bitcoin has value, and there are people who take Bitcoin for cash. But if we go to property, then like, we all agree that, let's say this room agrees that like this person owns this property and I own that property, but like who actually owns it? Like who do I go to say that like how do we treat the property, and like does everyone have to be included? Like right now the government, if I come and take the land, the government will be like, no, this is his land. But that's not how Bitcoin works. If someone takes another, since we developed it on our own, then the government is involved. It's decentralized. But I don't get how that works with property, and like someone has to back it up And like, do we all have to agree on one thing, or can we have small communities that will share some property? Like, does this have to be all or nothing? And how does that work when it comes to property versus cash?
So, one of the concepts around blockchain that didn't come out specifically or explicitly so far is the fact that for the first time we're able to create digital scarcity. Before blockchain, give me a song, I can copy a song, and it's really cheap to copy things digitally. With blockchain, you can actually have an entity, an element on that network that is unique and scarce. That's where this concept of smart property comes into play. So we can finance a co-op and say that, well, every unit of shares that I purchase are represented as individual units on this blockchain. Now, that representation means nothing unless there's a group or a community that agrees to respect whatever is represented on the blockchain. So I'm building a title management system on the blockchain, and my title management system is worth nothing until I can fit some banks or some title companies or some state recorders to say, hey, yeah, we're working with this company, and whatever we record on that blockchain is representative of our authoritative opinion. So I gave myself the World Trade Center on my system. Well, I don't own the World Trade Center because nobody recognizes what I recorded there. But when you look at a project like Naval, your project is a community. This group recognized that, hey, we're going to track our own collaboration and shares into this joint project that we have. We're going to track that on some distributed system, and we're going to respect that contract. And saying this, even just verbally or even more powerfully so in a contract, it is very, very much legal. Right? You could go to a judge and explain the concept behind Naval and say, you know what, you have this amount of obligations or responsibility or ownership into this project, and if someone disputes it, oh, I don't care, it's only on the blockchain. How do I know that you really own 20% of the co-working space or whatever? The judge will recognize what's been written, as long as it's explicit somewhere, what's written on the blockchain. So these agreements are represented using scarce items of ownership or smart entities on the blockchain. And as long as the community recognizes it, or some existing authority says, yep, I'm a big bank, and I agree with what's written on this blockchain, and I'm going to sign that transaction or whatever, then at that point we have more and more influence, or that blockchain has more and more meaning to the outside world.
So I guess, yeah, well, so as a real estate lawyer, I can't help but see this primarily as a legislative problem, which may be influenced in various ways. And I was very interested by your discussion of trust, because the whole problem with the American land title system is that it's not even a centralized system yet. It's before that. Like, you haven't even reached that point of development in the system. So this was already solved by a Torrance land title system in Australia in the 19th century, where the current problem is that if today in a county register in the US, what is registered puts people on record notice, but it can be challenged. You can sue somebody to say, I know you recorded in the county registry that so-and-so gave me this piece of land, but I challenge that because there's an older document that I found there that says whatever. With a very simple piece of legislation, all of that can disappear, and the billions of dollars generated for title insurance companies can also disappear. If you just say, whatever is in the county register in an online database is definitive, and will have an indemnity fund for people who are defrauded through the system, but otherwise, you cannot challenge it, which actually exists in some jurisdictions already. So my question actually is, do you think that this is sort of like to use an Uber example, a situation where a technology will come along that will be so persuasive and so economically persuasive that legislators will be forced to account for it? Because there's nothing glamorous about land title legislation. Nobody wants to deal with it. The UK completely modernized its land title system in 1925. only its colonies are still using medieval law that even England doesn't use anymore. And so that today, in fact, you're better protected buying a tea kettle than you are buying a piece of land, legally speaking. There are more legal protections for the sale of goods than for the sale of land. So do you think that blockchain will be that kind of technology that creates a market, the way that Uber created a market for cars owned by private individuals, that then forces the entire world, and especially lawmakers, to say, well, now we have to deal with the fact that we created an arbitrary monopoly for taxis, and we have to deal with this entirely new paradigm.
I sat down with county recorders, title insurance companies, and financing organizations, and I think that's where the change is going to happen. The banks who don't benefit from all the other middlemen that are involved in a transfer of a title, they're looking for a solution. They are not going to wait for legislative change because that takes too long. There's too much money involved. So the time, the risk, the fraud, obviously that's happening in a very complex system today, are all driving banks to figure out a private solution to that problem. And once you see some of the largest players in the space start to adopt a new technology, maybe mine, maybe something else out there, blockchain is very, very well positioned to solve that problem. So the United States, which does have a very archaic system, is well positioned to actually leapfrog a lot of the work that's been done in the 20th century in trying to modernize title management. The United States is well positioned to leapfrog that, and I think you see that with the amount of interest in what's known as fintech. A lot of banks right now, every bank in New York City right now has a blockchain project of some sort, trying to figure out what can we do with this. And to the extent where real estate is a large part of their portfolio, you can be sure that they're working on trying to figure out that problem.
So this is an interesting scenario. As you guys are talking, there's all this kind of secondary discourse happening on the screen behind you. Is there any, take another question from the audience, is there anything that someone has written on the doc or has seen on the doc that they'd like to point out? Just so that we can do that as a space for questions. Otherwise, we can ask if we're on Bill.
Well, you went ahead and made my question red, so.
Can you summarize?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've become very interested as of late in alternative definitions of architecture that I've been surrounded by more and more, which have always seemed to be completely missing in architectural discourse and in the way that I've been educated as an architect. In particular, the idea of information architecture, or the architecture as it would be defined by a computer science or a programmer, or practically anybody in the tech sector. And it seems like a really important realm for architects to be considering, because it is a really critical application of our skills as designers and systems thinkers. Yet I've never seen a really critical perspective on the abstract and completely virtual, non-physical and scaleless architectures that are changing the world, but are completely invisible. And I just wonder, what will it take for the architectural discipline to adapt and to define itself in a way that it can address both the physical and the digital, and can they do that before they're displaced or made irrelevant by programmers?
Just a comment on that? I mean, there are something, so maybe I'm not that word, I think it's called software architecture. There's political coders out there. I don't think it necessarily needs to be drafted with pen and paper. And then, curiously, there's also been historically some exchanges between, software engineering and architecture. A lot of the paradigms of software engineering are actually lending borrowing terminology from architecture. So I just see that will probably just come and who knows, depending on the economical, how the future ends up, it might be recognized as one field. But I don't see there's any lack of, it's
not in danger.
If anything, I would say that blockchain is information technology almost catching up to how we live. Right? We need centralized organizations. So we're not getting rid of those old mainframe servers yet, right? We still have client servers. So we need all models, right? Centralized, decentralized, and distributed. We live with systems like this in our day-to-day lives. We didn't have a good way to represent true peer-to-peer, which is a lot of our lives. This is your friend's network. This is how we live, most of our lives, I would argue. We didn't have a good way to represent peer-to-peer relationships on a virtual platform before the advent of blockchain. Now we have the ability to identify who you are. And by the way, just like in your real life, you can have multiple identities, right? You're someone when you're at school, you're someone else when you're at work, and when you go out to a bar, a little different too, right? So you do have multiple identities in your personal life, and on these blockchains, you can have an infinite number of identities, and me too, everybody else out here. And I'll know your reputation, I'll know you through one of these networks, and I will respect you or that identity of you because so many other people respect you and we've transacted peer-to-peer, and that is brand new. We don't know yet where it's going to go. But in a world where the Internet of Things is starting to impact architecture, where financing a project is still very complicated, being able to connect with one another in a very natural way is going to be a very powerful and life-changing tool.
So maybe on that point, and in regards to another question that I see up there, there's reasons that the R50 Bau grouping doesn't exist here. One of which is because you simply wouldn't be able to get land here. And so are there ways, this question is about convincing financiers or relating it to conventional structures, are there ways that blockchain could be used to circumvent that in a practical way to enable some of these cooperative models over land trusts? Could you, for instance, tokenize these processes? What would that look like?
Yeah, so I feel like you're dating me a little bit because we talk about this a lot, or you talk to me about it. One thing that is kind of new that architects can do with blockchains is they can democratize the design process because it's very cheap to specify ownership in projects now. Whereas today you need fancy lawyers and people have to promise a bunch of money if things go wrong and say, okay, I'll pay you this if this happens, and you pay this if this happens. You can specify with a few lines of code, the ownership structures that previously you would have needed lawyers for. So when you democratize the design process in that way, to your point, architects need to think about, they need to be careful about how they democratize and how they distribute the design process such that no one actor is able to monopolize the process in a way that isn't intended. So you have to sort of think about the architecture of the distribution of equity in a project. And you can be creative about it because it's so cheap now.
When you talk about equity, you mean capital?
Yeah, sure.
Or even
so is it the same way we talk about stakeholders in cooperative? Like equity in decentralized finance organization, for example, and equity in a cooperative housing development. Is that similar?
So no, I have a question.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. I have a question to Susanne. You mentioned when you were comparing the successful and the not successful, or what are the premises for these projects to succeed. It seems like, if I got it right, there are two factors. There's one here, you mentioned that land is public in the Zurich, and that ownership is separated of land and buildings. And there was another point, I think that was the main point that I got away from. It seems like there's no getting around ownership.
There's no getting around land. I think that's the key thing.
Is that the primary?
And that's, when we talk about scarcity, land is just, we talk about, physical, you can't move it, it's not a commodity, of course it gets more but and those two things were two different models. So the cooperatives in in Zurich that I talked about, they all got their land from the city, more or less. That's not the case for all of them. Some of them also buy land, but that, of course, helps in breaking down cost to get the public sector on their side in some way. Yeah, so then, yes, and in that sense, it's similar to the community land trust, which is a U.S. invention, right? Where again, that sort of separates. So it takes the, let's say, it takes the land cost out of the equation, but you're right, somebody, in the system we live in, somebody owns the land, whether that's the public sector or...
But it seems also to, like, it seems to be necessary that there's like a market anomaly in that, like, okay, either the government for you, whatever long-term incentives, decides to give away or lend it for the period of lifetime of the project, or that it's already like set at a lower price than market will have. So there seems to be like an intervention. If one only let market forces loose, it seems like this system is not stable. And I think this question here, that we want is sort of like proof of that. Like, if you don't protect this as an active act, then they will kind of crumble. Is that correct, or is there some kind of like? I'm not a total free market advocate, but we are in that space, so I'm very concerned about making resistant spaces. And does this even change with the introduction of the blockchain? I'm not sure. It seems like if we don't solve the resistance, then all of this other is just like different ways of like hoarding property, be it digitally or with shotguns and whatever. That's a question.
No, I mean, to me it's also a question. I don't know if it changes because everything with the simplifying deeds, that's great. But if it's all still about selling to the highest bidder,
it isn't, right? And I think maybe that's where something is different with the blockchain system, is that on the blockchain, it all depends on the contract that you write in it. The contract doesn't have to be highest bidder. The contract can be sweat equity. Hey, I'm going to work hard at this. I'm not investing money, but...
That's already the case without the blockchain.
No, for sure. But now we can record that on a ledger that keeps the history and tracks all of this. It was, at least prior to blockchain, it was hard to do that in a way that cannot be cheated or manipulated. And now we finally, maybe again, this is a case where technology is catching up with how humans interact, but now we can actually represent these kind of, we can make whatever contract we want, and so it really doesn't have to be about highest bidder or most work or whatever.
But that's the market by definition. I mean, I can choose to sell my piece of property to whoever at whatever price I can get. I don't have to go to the highest bidder, right? So that's it, right? So I think the interesting question that comes up that you posed is, what is the public sector? What does blockchain do for a notion of public good or public sector? Or if you now got a call tomorrow from the IRS and said, you need to come work for us, we need to improve our tax collection.
The one thing I'll say then, from a public perspective, probably one of the #1 attributes of the blockchain, you mentioned that in your talk, is that it is an open ledger. Everybody can see everything that's written in it. So if we finance a project, of course we can try to keep our identity secret, so there's a lot of privacy and anonymity possible as well. But if we publicize, if a state entity or private entity says, hey, this is my address, and I'm going to raise funds here in order to generate whatever project, anybody can go monitor these addresses and see the in and the outs of those transactions and monitor what's going on around it. So it is a very, it's at once very private, but it's also very open and out in the open that anybody can audit, if you will, that these transactions have taken place. What does that mean? Again, none of us know, right? I mean, none of us are really experts. Nobody can figure out how 5, 10, 15 years this technology will change how we contract and interact with one another.
But I mean,
No,
the interesting thing is the voting example, right? I'm going to insist on sort of this public sector or democracy thing, right? So, I mean, even with the state of the internet that we have today, this country could have changed the way it registers voters, how we vote. It's possible, but there's no will to do it. So why would that change with?
So I think there actually are opportunities to use code as law more powerful than existing law. So here in New York City, Stuytown was recently sold, and the mayor made the new owner promise that they would keep some part of it affordable for 30 years or whatever. And that was just like a political decision that was made, like there were politicians who talked to the developers, blah, blah, blah. But let's say that, you know, at some point in history, a bunch of people got together and said, we're going to start a co-op, and this co-op is going to be affordable forever. You could specify that in a smart contract and say that, so if you tokenize the ownership of it and distribute the equity in that way, you could specify the tokens such that it's only possible to sell them to an identity which you know is of a certain income level with a certain level of certainty. And you could specify that such that it could never be changed no matter what. So I would argue that blockchains, yeah, they do give us a stronger ability than existing law potentially to encode our ideals into along with facts.
Any questions? Yeah.
There seems to be a conundrum, I guess, if you have replace Airbnb with a blockchain, because then you're going to eliminate the third party, but it's critical that you have feedback between the renter and the rentee, and it can't reside at the renter because he's going to show bias towards the good side, I guess, right? So then how are you going to have feedback with a two-party blockchain for Airbnb?
Two-word answer to that, because it's a long answer. Reputation oracles. Oracles act as truth, and their truth is determined by their reputation. So, in short, many third parties.
So it's equally, it's distributed then all over, I guess. But what's the motivation to have feedback by the prior renters, I guess?
You could find some way to incentivize it in the contract. Like, it could be the case that if I have left a lot of feedback on places where I have stayed and people have found my feedback useful, they will then say that I am a useful, source for feedback, and that increases my reputation. So you can put weak little incentives in there, which have a net effect of incentivizing people to do these helpful things with the ecosystem.
Okay.
Yeah. Is there any preventing anyone from buying out or increasing the size of the blockchain so that one entity controls 51% of it?
Well, yeah. So Christian and I were just talking about this earlier. I actually think that the 51% attack is an underrated threat to blockchains. An actor with a lot of money, like a government, I think, could destroy a blockchain with a 51% attack. So I'm supposed to be up here as a blockchain advocate, and I am, but I think that the 51% attack is actually important to solve the problem.
Okay. Yeah, if you convince more than half the network that you're the source of truth and you've got something nefarious in your code.
But you don't have to convince them, right? You can just build out the network until you have
if you just have enough CPU power, that's all it takes.
That's true. That's true.
And it's expensive. So
if there was a corporation to do it, right?
Yeah, but so here's the thing. Like, if you are, we should have Joe Lubin up here, some economists talking about this. There are interesting ideas about this. Like, it would cost you, I don't know, $600 million to take over the Bitcoin blockchain, and in doing that, you would destroy all of Bitcoin's value. Because as soon as the blockchain is compromised, Bitcoin has zero value. Right? It's insecure.
So the network would recognize your hack or your power, and therefore the confidence in this peer-to-peer system would go down. So you would invest money just to kill it, and as soon as it's dead, your money will be worthless.
Yeah, so that you would need an actor with motivation to spend a huge amount of money to destroy an even huger amount of money. And that's all they get out of it. It's just the destruction of value.
A question here, we have one in the back, and then we'll go over to Dan.
Mine dovetailed off that. Let me just in having enough, I guess, kind of false identities in a way to eventually control it. But coming from like the malicious side of it, how can you use this for that or to take over the currency or to
Well,
that nature?
so what would your motivation be in wanting to destroy Bitcoin, for example, or wanting to take over the Bitcoin network? Your only motivation, I think, could be to want to steal Bitcoins. But as soon as you enable yourself to do that, like people, the reason that Bitcoins have value is the same reason like a euro has value relative to a US dollar. People are willing to spend US dollars to buy euros. People are willing to spend US dollars to buy Bitcoins. If Bitcoin is compromised, no one's going to be willing to spend US dollars to buy Bitcoin anymore, and has no value. So unless you're like a madman and you just want to destroy value and you have $100 million to do it.
Or it could be like a government. So say Bitcoin is transacting, maybe that's, you know, a key funding source for ISIS or for some sort of terrorist activity. That would be the reason to destroy it and eliminate the value because funding, money, drives the world as we know it. So if you cut off a funding source.
I think the governments are a threat.
Okay.
Yep, I think you're right.
Okay, so we're going that way in the back and then over to Dan.
Yeah, I think the whole blockchain applications are fascinating. I wonder about like a couple underlying assumptions. I think one is that it represents the public. And I would question just to panelists like what that public is. Like how do we incorporate the blockchain for those who have limited access to digital societies, those who don't have means to access computers? And I guess the second question is like if it's distributed property, then who is it distributed to? It seems like in some ways the blockchain is enabling systems that are sort of neoliberal in their economic output or economic outlook, but we sort of know also intuitively that those systems are not necessarily inherently equitable, that they play into certain kinds of systems that increase disparity. Is there sort of a way to maybe tweak the blockchain to shift us back towards a position of social equity? Or?
There's a lot of the benefits if you look in the Bitcoin space, particularly because it is kind of the oldest blockchain out there. A lot of the benefits and interest into Bitcoin comes from the underdeveloped world, so the unbanked and people that don't have title registries, national recorded and all that. So there's so the second and the third world, there definitely is a lot of interest in using this technology to leapfrog all the development that's been done here in America and Europe over the last 100 years or whatnot. But at the same time, you point out a very, very valid, I guess, weakness in the system. Particularly if you're going to use it as a mobile type, system where I'm walking around and I've got my assets, my smart contracts, and my bitcoins or whatever on my phone, and I want to transact with someone else. Yeah, I need network access. And to the extent where network is not available, there's ways to mitigate that. You can sign transactions just locally on the phone until you get to your home or hotel room or some the post office where you might have an internet access, and there you can post your transaction to the network. But then there's going to be a delay, which obviously will impact the nature of what you can do with those kind of transactions. Ubiquitous network access is definitely a need if you're going to want to do things in real time. It's also a weakness in the system. If the internet goes down and suddenly we're not able to communicate peer-to-peer, then the peer-to-peer networking is not very valuable anymore. Those are kind of extreme scenarios. I don't see the power structure or the internet going down anytime soon, but yeah, definitely in a peer-to-peer system, we need to be able to communicate electronically with one another.
I guess my question's kind of up there right now, but kind of touching on what Kristoffer and Susanne were talking about in terms of communal land trusts. An attorney recently described to me that basically a CLT, a communal land trust, is a mechanism to complicate the ownership of a land, a third experts, a surrounding community, a third users of the land, so that in effect it's nearly impossible to sell the land at any given point. So I guess in some ways it seems that, like in this case, the CLT, which has as its motive some sort of resistance, to quote Kristoffer, or some sort of permanent affordability, requires explicitly to kind of halt or slow down market activity or the buying and selling of land per se. But these kind of blockchain technologies with real estate have at their focus sure transparency or sure kind of a trust, a lack of need for trustlessness. But I'm curious if there's any provisions for
slowing down contracts? Like, in other words, isn't the technology focused on how to make contracts more rapid, more trust, requiring less trust? Doesn't that actually induce more activity? And is there kind of some sort of meta check on how to make contracts that stop contracts from happening? Is there a contract that says, thus, with this contract, we will not make any contracts for 100 years in case that's more?
People were going to think of things that none of us have thought about.
Yeah, I could answer that. But so what worries me, so the short answer is yes, you can do that. The problem that I'm thinking about, and I don't really understand, is the sort of like total unleash of free market forces on the blockchain. It's kind of like unprecedented. In like financial terms, we're talking about like 0 transaction costs, right? Like it literally costs nothing to engage in these markets. And I do not only mean like monetarily, but like in time, investment, privilege, and all. And so even if you imagine a land trust where you can very easily look, I'm not gonna, this contract is not active until 50 years from now, and all those things, you're also dealing seemingly, and I'm not sure about this, on a market where participants in the blockchain, and we're talking individuals, we're talking about corporations, we're talking about other machines, all engaging together, they need to be financially incentivized to prefer those contracts over one where that rule is not in place. This is just basic market economy, right? And it's unclear to me, like why a priori that would be enforced. So even if you create a whole beautiful system with, you know, all these, the retardation built in for whatever purposes, it will only be valid if people recognize it to be valid. And for example, in their contracts then that build upon land ownership say, oh, we're only going to recognize land ownership from contracts which have this retardation claim in them. Right? That's like a cascading effect of reputation. And what's really unknown to me, I don't know anyone has an answer, is like, well, what's going to be preferred? Like what's the selection mechanism over this like potentially infinite space of legal and social contracts? Because we're not only talking about people designing programs for specific purposes, but instantly, since all the source code available, they will be cloned, they'll be modified. We'll see genetical algorithms on contracts. They'll be, and through the interaction of machines and individuals and corporations being able through smart contracts actually engage in financial activities, we have essentially like you know, in genetics, you have an environment that punishes certain individuals and lets other ones procreate. And so we're looking at a really new kind of ecosystem. And the dynamics of this ecosystem, I don't understand them.
I would say people respond to incentives, right? I do something because something. So if you write a contract that is not attractive to me, or does not benefit me in any way, I'm just not going to deal with it. Right? All blockchain, I think, can help. Blockchain is going to tell you what contract you write or not. You write whatever smart contract you want. And I think what blockchain can help us, however, do is avoid these scenarios like in your slide where a building was built for a purpose and then used for something totally different, right? The will of the individuals who actually are using the building, obviously, was missed, right? So I think blockchain will help us democratize, just like the web did, help us democratize opinion and sharing of opinion with one another. I think blockchain will bring that to financial and many other transactions, where at least your will, whether you engage in a contract with me or with him or whatever is most beneficial to you individually, your will be more easily represented or acted upon into a system that is, that has a higher level of democracy, if you want to call it that, like blockchain. It's not guaranteeing that there's good or bad contract. There will be all sorts of nefarious things on blockchain too. But you can only engage, or you decide what you want to engage with in a peer-to-peer system.
For now.
Well, one conversation.
Until it gets centralized, right? That's what you're saying.
sprinkling some Greek joking consensus, all this sprinkle from blockchain. That's all fine and good. But I think for, especially since your question relates to 50 years in the future, I think, I think it's very difficult.
Well, I had an interesting conversation with Miron recently, who is a guy who works at ConsenSys, and he has this idea that people will be able to sort of passively incentivize the behavior of the rest of the economy by choosing or deciding what to them money is and what money has what value. So because with any given denomination of a currency on a blockchain, we can see its entire history back to when it was first mined. You can say, okay, tokens which have been used, tokens or currencies which have been used in such a way, I'm just not going to accept that these are money, because using money in this way defies my values. Similarly, you could say tokens which have been used in this other way, this is worth double what it otherwise would be to me, because this is very much in alignment with my value. So I thought that was an interesting idea about how people could sort of passively vote, if you will, on how other people should behave.
So can we have time for 2 more questions?
We talked about the democratization of the transactional currency. I'm asking myself the question which democracy, whose democracy, because this same kind of thing, I think it's happening right now in EU, where Greece wants to, they are trapped into that because they share the currency with Germany, but they don't have so they have the same currency policy, but they don't have the same economics and market, basically. So they have, once you have the currency that cross the border, national border, where they lack the central bank to intervene to adapt, I wonder what kind of damage that will cause.
Yeah, that's totally uncharted territory. I can really like, nobody knows what's going to happen when there is a single global currency. It's worth noting that we can like just rebuild the world that we have today exactly on a blockchain. We probably won't choose to do that. And yeah, I don't know. That would be an idea.
Okay, last question. Anybody like have a burning?
So what's an entity like? Is an entity like my microwave and is it a phase of a sweetie and it's my thing? Like we're all equal in the blockchain system.
Yeah, and also like code is equal to like there's no way to distinguish between a human and like a contract that's spawned by a contract, etc. Yeah.
Hopefully you will build a better reputation than your microwave.
Yeah, you might not.
But you might not.
I mean, if we're still up for asking questions, we have.
Well, a couple points to this. What's the 2-part? So the first is, do you envision that the blockchain is going to become universally adopted? That the layperson, every one of us, needs to be able to write code. The second is, does that create disparity in between people who can actually write code and utilize blockchain in a way that a layperson can't? And finally, if you think that blockchain being adopted universally will require something like a universal basic income to actually happen.
I'll let the best coder answer that question.
I don't know that the best coder is able to thank you. To live in a blockchain world, you will not have to be a coder. All you'll have to know or have to do is spend money and use the internet the way that you do today. And you'll sort of develop an awareness of new things you can do with your money and with the internet. Will there continue to be a stratification in terms of incomes between people who can code and people who can't? Yes, I don't think that's like exactly blockchain's fault. Exactly, it's just the market is valuing software skills. Blockchains will accelerate that, and Internet of Things, and driverless cars, all these things. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily blockchain's fault. Normal people won't need to know how to code. And you asked a third thing?
Just this idea of the universal basic income is sort of popping up a lot in many countries.
Yeah, there's a colleague of ours in Germany named Martin who's really interested in the universal basic income, but I haven't been following it closely myself. You? Oh, okay. Okay.
How can I afford that?
There are people in the blockchain space who seem to be drawn to universal basic income, perhaps more than the general population. I don't know what it's all about myself. I apologize.
Is that because it's going to put so many people out of work?
That could totally be it.
I'll do a parallel maybe with the web today, right? You can write a blog entry on WordPress on some blog site and you don't know how to code HTML or web stuff. And you can go to your PayPal account and program an automatic payment every month to some partner that you're purchasing some service from without knowing how to program. So the successful blockchain companies will be those that can obviously shield this level of complexity from you and allow you to express your will, your values, your needs, and your whatever you want to do with the blockchain system without you having to learn code function.
That's a question. I'm really curious about.
Sure. Which question?
The democracy is a term often thrown around in relation to blockchain as a positive.
At the very bottom.
Bob, I'll ask a question.
So
future will tell.
Unpacking the word democracy and what it actually does anybody have a comment?
I'm into democracy myself. I would argue against it.
I would say if there's a downside to democracy that I can speak about publicly without hopefully getting lynched, I mean, there is very much of a two wolves in a sheep, right? You know, it's a majority rule in democracy. We all raise our hands and the majority says yay, and I voted nay and I'm kind of like left out, which is not, I mean, it's perceived somewhat as a bad thing if I disagree with the democratic decision there. Yeah, that same system can be represented in smart contracts on the blockchain, so we'll have the same pros and cons of democracy. And someone else may start another system where it's very much of a, non-vote, don't matter. Maybe someone creates a blockchain where the guy who has the most money is the one who makes the decision, which is definitely not democratic. So yes, your values can be encoded in a smart contract, and what those values are, whether they're good or bad, as long as you convince other people to join your network, you'll be able to play with people with similar values as yourself.
Okay, last comment.
I will just differentiate the question.
Last comment. Literally the last comment, sorry. I'm getting a lot of advice over here.
We take for granted that democracy, the basis of democracy is individuals today, and I think that will change. We might still want to call it democracy, but
So we're gonna wrap it up. I think there's a group of us going to get drinks. So if you want to continue the conversation,
We have tons of wine and cheese.
Obviously, lots of interesting questions. Thank you guys for coming. Thank you.
I'll download it and have Matt bring it back.